Imagine being told your intelligence can be measured by a number, a single score, derived from a series of puzzles, patterns, and questions. That number could determine whether you qualify for gifted programs, what schools you attend, and even your chances of being hired. It's called your intelligence quotient, or IQ. But what does that number really mean? And more importantly, is it fair? The debate over IQ tests has raged for more than a century. Some hail them as one of psychology's greatest achievements, a standardized way to measure cognitive ability across large populations. Others see them as flawed tools that reflect cultural bias and reinforce systemic racism. To understand this controversy, we need to go back to the origins of IQ testing. At the turn of the 20th century, French psychologist Alfred Binet was tasked with identifying school children in need of special assistance. He created a test that measured attention, memory, and problem-solving skills. But Binet never claimed it measured innate intelligence. He warned that intelligence was too complex and fluid to be captured by a single score. Yet within a few decades, his work was transformed into something very different. In the United States, psychologist Lewis Terman adapted Binet's test into what became known as the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale. Terman believed intelligence was largely inherited and unchangeable. He saw IQ as a fixed trait, like eye color. This idea was eagerly embraced by early 20th century eugenicists, who used IQ tests to argue for sterilization laws, immigration restrictions, and the segregation of inferior races. By the 1920s and 30s, IQ testing had become a tool of power. Intelligence tests were administered to immigrants at Ellis Island, often in English, even if the test takers spoke no English at all. Not surprisingly, many immigrants scored poorly. These results were used to support the idea that certain ethnic groups, particularly Southern and Eastern Europeans, were less intelligent and less desirable. Similar patterns appeared when IQ tests were given to African Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanic populations, often under culturally biased conditions. Critics pointed out that the questions on IQ tests often reflected white middle-class experiences. For example, a child growing up in rural Alabama or on a Navajo reservation might be unfamiliar with the cultural references embedded in certain questions. Even the structure of the test, timed sections, written instructions, abstract reasoning, favored those with formal education and familiarity with test-taking environments. Yet despite these concerns, IQ testing gained immense popularity. It was used in the military, in schools, in prisons, and by employers. By the 1960s, IQ had become a kind of scientific shorthand for intelligence itself, but then came a firestorm. In 1969, psychologist Arthur Jensen published a controversial paper claiming that differences in IQ scores between racial groups were largely genetic. He argued that educational reforms couldn't close the so-called achievement gap because the differences were rooted in biology. This claim ignited intense backlash, particularly from civil rights leaders and scientists who saw Jensen's conclusions as not only flawed, but dangerous. Jensen's paper laid the groundwork for even more incendiary arguments. In 1994, Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray published The Bell Curve, a book that claimed intelligence was the best predictor of life outcomes, and that African Americans scored, on average, lower than whites on IQ tests. The implication was clear. Social inequalities might be the result of natural differences in intelligence. The public reaction was explosive. Critics accused the bell curve of promoting a modern form of scientific racism. Scholars dismantled its methodology, pointing out that it confused correlation with causation and ignored the vast influence of environment, poverty, and systemic discrimination. And yet, the book became a bestseller. So what does modern science actually say? Let's begin with what IQ tests do measure. Psychologists generally agree that IQ tests can reliably assess certain cognitive skills. Verbal reasoning, spatial visualization, working memory, and processing speed. People who score high on IQ tests often do better in school and perform well on complex tasks. There is also a concept known as G, or general intelligence, a statistical construct that accounts for performance across a range of mental abilities. But intelligence is not a monolith. Howard Gardner proposed the theory of multiple intelligences: linguistic, logical mathematical, musical, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and more. Other researchers emphasize emotional intelligence, creativity, or practical problem solving. None of these are captured by traditional IQ tests. Now, let's address the elephant in the room: the racial IQ gap. Yes, studies have consistently shown that different racial and ethnic groups score differently, on average, on standardized IQ tests. But here's the catch: average differences do not imply genetic differences. Take height, for example. In the Netherlands, people are taller than in Indonesia, but that doesn't mean Dutch genes are superior. It likely reflects differences in nutrition, healthcare, and living conditions. The same logic applies to IQ. Environmental factors play a huge role. Access to education, early childhood stimulation, lead exposure, nutrition, stress, and even the effects of racism itself. In fact, studies have shown that when African American children are adopted into affluent white families, their IQ scores often rise significantly. This suggests that the environment, not genetics, is the driving force. Similarly, the so-called Flynn effect, named after researcher James Flynn, shows that average IQ scores have been rising worldwide over the past century. This improvement can't be due to genetics. It reflects better schooling, nutrition, and access to information. And what about the tests themselves? Are they biased? Research suggests that modern IQ tests have improved in terms of cultural fairness. Test developers use statistical techniques to identify and eliminate culturally loaded questions. But no test is ever completely neutral. Language barriers, stereotype threat, and unfamiliar testing environments can all affect performance. For example, when students are reminded of negative stereotypes about their race or gender before a test, their scores often drop, a phenomenon known as stereotype threat. So where does that leave us? IQ tests are not inherently racist, but they have been used in racist ways. They can provide useful information about certain kinds of cognitive abilities, but they don't capture the full range of human intelligence. And they should never be used as the sole measure of a person's potential or worth. Instead of asking whether IQ tests are valid or racist, perhaps we should ask a deeper question. What do we mean by intelligence? Is it the ability to solve a math problem quickly, or to navigate a complex social situation? Is it creativity, empathy, resilience? In our increasingly diverse and interconnected world, we need a broader, more inclusive view of intelligence, one that recognizes different strengths, honors different ways of thinking, and avoids reducing people to a single number. And most importantly, we must remain vigilant. History has shown us how easily science can be misused to justify inequality. But science at its best can also be a tool for liberation, a way to uncover truths, challenge assumptions, and build a more just and equitable society. So the next time someone tells you their IQ score, remember, it's just one piece of the puzzle. Intelligence is vast, multifaceted, and ever-changing, just like the human mind itself, and that is far too complex to be measured by a number alone.